America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds. Welcome to Battlegrounds. On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our guest is Yalda Hakim, an award-winning foreign correspondent who currently anchors the flagship program Impact with Yalda Hakim on BBC World News. In addition to her presenting duties, Yalda continues to deliver hard-hitting journalism across BBC News in both television and radio. Yalda has reported extensively on the rise and fall of the Islamic State in Iraq. She has traveled to the world's youngest nation, South Sudan, which has been embroiled in a brutal civil war. She reported that more than 4 million people were on the brink of famine in that devastated country. She has also highlighted the plight of people in the secretive state of Eritrea, covered U.S. elections in 2008, 2012, and 2020, reported from Turkey following the failed coup attempt, covered the aftermath of the earthquake in Nepal, kidnappings by drug cartels in Mexico, and jihadism in Sweden. She has investigated and reported on people trafficking and torture of Ethiopian migrants in Yemen, and following the Bangladesh garment factory collapse, uncovered workers still being put at risk in unsafe premises. Yalda also conducts high-profile interviews with global leaders and public figures. Before joining BBC World News, Yalda was the presenter of SBS Dateline in Australia. In 2018, Yalda launched the Yalda Hakim Foundation for Young Women in partnership with the American University of Afghanistan. The foundation aims to support the professional advancement of exceptionally talented in Afghanistan. Yalda was born in Afghanistan and fled with her family as a result of the Soviet invasion, emigrating to Australia. Today, Yalda joins us to discuss her film, Return of the Taliban, which explores the Taliban of today, what they stand for, and what is at stake in the unfolding catastrophe in Afghanistan. Yalda Hakim, welcome to Battlegrounds. Having been on the receiving end of your hard-hitting questions, I look forward to this role reversal and getting to ask you the questions. So welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much, General. It's great to be here.
Yalda, your documentary provides a window into the lives of Afghans. And your interviews, I think, really reveal what has occurred in Afghanistan, what's happened in terms of the transformation of Afghanistan, or what did happen after 2001. And I'm thinking of your discussion with your friend Masood, who a friend of yours, a photojournalist who was the subject of assassination attempts, and then your interview with a really courageous Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission leader, and she was investigating human rights in Afghanistan, a young mother. She talked about her colleagues who were killed by bombs and so forth. And I just wanted to ask you, you provide a window into the lives of people who were helping to transform the country. What do you want viewers to conclude about the nature of Afghanistan's transformation between 2001 and just a few weeks ago?
General, I think that the focus of this war in the last 2 decades has really been on, how things have been wasted or nothing has really been achieved. And what I was hoping to really get across in this documentary was that the gains that we keep talking about, the fact that I call them the quintessential 9/11 generation. These are people, when we talk about the 9/11 generation, perhaps Americans or the world would see it as in the lens of war. But actually, these are people who were Pulitzer Prize-winning photographers, who were human rights activists, who took the opportunities that were given to them and really made the most of the freedoms and gains that they were given. And so I wanted to really capture those gains, the 9/11 generation, the sort of brilliance of these people. And when we talk about the wave of refugees now, I often tell people that you are sort of getting the best and brightest of a nation coming your way. These people leave reluctantly. They don't want to leave their homelands. They had communities. They had foreign visas in their passports. They didn't want to leave. Shahrazad, for example, the human rights activist in my piece, the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, she had several colleagues who were assassinated, and she had a foreign visa in her passport. She didn't want to leave. In fact, the State Department and various other groups were pushing her to leave up until the day that Kabul fell. She finally agreed to go because she realized, the Taliban were marching into the capital. So I suppose what I want people to get out of this is that when we talk about Afghanistan, it wasn't a lost cause. When we talk about Afghanistan, there were these incredible people that had love for nation and wanted to see Afghanistan go to another level. And it was on the way there. It wasn't all lost.
Yalda, it's heartbreaking to see, because there had been this narrative for so long of, it's not worth it. We've wasted so much. And of course, those who you see who are the subjects of your documentary, those who you interview, were really people worth defending. The other side of that is really the nature of the enemy, and because of the heinous, brutal nature of the Taliban and the groups that are affiliated with them, I think that's another reason to have sustained our effort there. But it also points to the future danger, right? The danger of associated with the reestablishment of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan under Taliban rule. And in your documentary, I think these are some of the more fascinating interviews. You have one with Sohail Shaheen, right? This is the Taliban spokesman and their former envoy to the United Nations. And he is trying hard to reinforce what we hear oftentimes these days, that, the Taliban has really in mind a more benign form of Sharia. But even in that interview with you, he's internally inconsistent and contradictory. And what would you say you want viewers to take away from this documentary in connection with the nature of the Taliban and some of these assumptions some are making, that the Taliban will share power, that the Taliban will impose a more benign form of Sharia, maybe have some kind of an inclusive government that would maybe even be a worthy partner in a fight against jihadist terrorist organizations? This seems delusional to me, but what do you think viewers should take away from the interviews you had, essentially with what I would call the enemy?
When we talk about the Taliban's role in counterterrorism, I suppose it's wishful thinking, isn't it? That they can turn the Taliban into partners. I spoke to some friends who are still in Kabul, and they said the night that the Americans withdrew and we had celebratory gunfire across the city, he said it went on for hours and hours and hours, from about 1 o'clock in the morning till the early hours of the morning. He said the children were frightened. They're all hiding. They were unsure about what was actually going on. And in many ways, it felt like, even though people spoke about Afghanistan being this violent nation, General, there's a softness about Kabul. There's something gentle about it. There's something gentle about the morning breeze in Kabul. And even though when you can sense that maybe things are becoming sinister or there might be an attack, there's something gentle about the Afghan people. And often I've heard this phrase that Afghans like to fight, but they don't like to kill. And I think in many ways, I suppose when we look at the Taliban and what they are today, and the violence that has been brought in just from those kinds of acts, I think we also need to understand that the Taliban, from my experience, are not one homogenous sort of entity. What Sohail Shaheen was telling me was, I suppose, what the Vice President Amrullah Saleh had said to me, and that was that they have become savvier at deceiving, and that they'd gone through some kind of very complex PR machine and knew the right wording to use for Western media. Now, when I went to Kabul and met with the commander, the field commander, the frontline commander, I asked him about public executions, for example, and he said, well, of course we would have public executions. Of course we had stoning if a woman was accused of adultery. Of course we would amputate hands and feet. Of course we want to go back to the 90s, because what was wrong with what we had? And so even now, when I asked Sahel Shaheen about house-to-house raids and going after people and revenge attacks, and he says, that's not our policy. And I say to him, but that's what's happening. He says, yes, but that is not our policy. And so you realize, actually, that there's the Taliban sort of leadership, and then there's the foot soldiers, the young men on the ground with weapons, running around the country, feeling very much empowered, and feeling like, okay, now they have control over the city again. And perhaps, I don't know if the leadership can bring them in.
You talked about really the self-delusion and wishful thinking. One part of the documentary that I think brings this out brilliantly is your interview with Maulana, this Taliban official terrorist who we forced really the Afghan government to release from prison as part of what I would describe as the capitulation agreement with the Taliban in 2020. And of course, he went right back to the battlefield. Could you talk about that interview and what you think viewers should conclude, not only about the nature of the Taliban and this this brutal terrorist organization that's in control of Afghanistan now, but also just by the lead up to the collapse in Afghanistan, and what it tells us about this sort of concession and the other concessions that were made by America on our way out of the war.
I think one thing that was clear was that the Afghan government and the Afghan allies and partners were left out of the peace process. This was a deal that was struck, between the United States and the Taliban. And there were certain conditions and agreements. When you go back to the Doha agreement, you realize it was the United States telling the Taliban, don't turn this into a terrorist haven, break ties with Al-Qaeda, don't allow it to become a threat to us. And then, we're happy to withdraw, and as long as you meet those conditions. And the Afghan government and the Afghan people were very much left out of the process. And so this whole pressure to release 5,000 prisoners, we saw the result of that, and we continue to see the result, where today very deadly Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters have been released from these prisons. And we see the kinds of attacks like the one at the airport that we saw just last week. The Afghan government, the vice president, the president himself, in my conversations with them, have said they've expressed so much anger about the 5,000 prisoners that have been released. And we saw that in Maulana, a very dangerous Taliban commander who ended up fighting in Lashkargah and in Helmand. He went back to the battlefield. And even in those final days of the war, he was there leading about 300 men in the fight there. And this is someone who, we were told, needs to be released because he's an innocent Taliban fighter and he's not going to carry on fighting. When in fact, that wasn't the case. He said to me, I don't care if it takes me 40 years or 200 years. We will not stop until we overthrow this government.
And it really exposes, I think, what you already brought up, the kind of the hypocrisy and fraud of the Taliban Political Commission in Doha. And I think Amrullah Saleh had said something like that it's, he said that it's really just a veneer. He said the group in Doha, I think, are a facade of a very dark reality of the Taliban. But I think that for years, going back to the Obama administration, we aided and abetted the Taliban in creating, right, this false veneer of a more benign Taliban. We actually, in many ways, I think, conjured up the enemy we would prefer in Afghanistan, rather than confront the actual enemy. What are your thoughts about the what happened in Doha, the whole so-called peace process going back to 2010, and what do you think the viewers of your documentary ought to know about those with whom Zal Khalilzad and then Secretary Pompeo negotiated with and then concluded that deal that I think in many ways in February 2020 sealed the fate of the Afghan people?
You sort of talked about what we wanted the Taliban to be, and you remember the phrase good Taliban, bad Taliban. Yeah. We use that so much, all of these sorts of phrases over the years, where we would try to box them or try to understand them. I've spoken to people here when I've interviewed them on my show, and they've said, actually, it's all just one ideology. They just know how to sell themselves in different sorts of ways. They've become savvier than they were in the 90s. But in fact, what we will see play out in Afghanistan is frankly, a totalitarian society is what it's going to become. And sadly, while maybe tens of thousands of people have fled, there's still 38 million people who will have to live under the banner of the Taliban. And they won't sort of have the freedoms and opportunities that these last 20 years gave them. But I think what happened in Doha is again, that the Afghans themselves were left out of the process. A deal was struck between the United States under the leadership of Secretary Pompeo and Zalmay Khalilzad, and they worked out that for as long as the Taliban are not a threat to us and the homeland, then they can, I suppose, take over the country, or this government can collapse, and it won't sort of make that much of a difference. Although if you speak to Zalmay Khalilzad, he will say that he tried to reach out to Ashraf Ghani, and they were being very stubborn, and they didn't want, the Afghan elite let down the Afghan people. But I think ultimately, as you say, the seal, this sort of the fate of the Afghan people was sort of, it was already sealed during those Doha talks. The Afghan nation was never really given a chance. And I think ultimately the government was weak, and they did let down their people. There were so many incredible people in that country who had a love for nation and wanted to see Afghanistan turn into something quite extraordinary. In our mutual friend Saad Mohseni through Tolo News, you can see the kind of incredible progress that they've made, and various other people. And to sort of say that Afghanistan should have been a Denmark, as you put it, or one of these other nations within 20 years was also unfair. We've been in Korea for 70 years. The US still has a presence in Germany, for example. So to sort of give a time frame to it. And someone said to me, you shouldn't be sort of surprised about the withdrawal, and actually the finger of blame shouldn't just be on Biden and Trump. This is something that administrations going back as far as the Obama administration wanted out, the surge, and then we saw the timeline that was given to the Taliban, and we hear these phrases of we've got sort of watches and they've got time, that they were not going anywhere, and they were going to stay until they won this war. And they were very clear about their strategy and what they wanted as a result of this. They wanted the Islamic Emirate. They were going to fight to the death till they got it. What was our strategy? What was the policy of the United States and the West and the allies over the years? Was there a clear-cut strategy? And did the Afghan government and the Afghan National Army understand what that was? Was that sort of joint in terms of what NATO and the West wanted? We heard so many phrases and slogans: nation building, hearts and minds, blood and treasure over the years. But did that actually ever translate into anything?
Yeah, I think, paradoxically, we took a short-term approach to a long-term problem. We kept saying, hey, we're leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving. Now we're really leaving. Well, it turned out to be a 20-year war, but it wasn't a 20-year war. It was a one-year war fought 20 times over. And I think that the effect, right, of us saying we're leaving all the time really resulted in a wide range of behaviors, hedging behavior, and so forth. And of course, the last administration to deal with this is the Biden administration. And I think that what we've heard from them is astounding as well, that they had no agency. They couldn't have reversed, this capitulation agreement of the Trump administration, which I kind of reject. And I think, in fact, the Biden administration may have even gone further in empowering the Taliban on our way out. One of the interviews that you do is with a young recruit. I think it's a particularly moving interview in the documentary, who said that, hey, I'm going to take risks. I may have to make a sacrifice, but I'm doing it for future generations. He must have been, I think, 18 years old or something. And a new recruit being trained as the Taliban were taking over large portions of the country. The narrative we've heard from the Biden administration has been one of, the Afghans didn't fight hard. Of course, as you know, over 60,000 Afghans gave their lives to preserve the freedoms they've enjoyed since 2001. Could you really talk about this young recruit and other Afghans who were willing to fight and who did fight and make sacrifices, and who let them down, and who failed them?
This young man that you talk about, it was quite extraordinary meeting him. So young, 18 years old, far from home, getting trained up, at this academy, ready to go out on the front lines. And he talked to me about, just like any young person, he wanted to go to university or he wanted to travel abroad. But actually, for him, the freedom that he wanted for his country, and that he didn't see his values being in line with that of the Taliban. And this was a young man from the south of the country. He was from a Pashtun household, and so, there's often talk about, ethnic warfare within Afghanistan, or the administration has talked about civil war and tribalism. But here is a young man who one would think was of the same ethnic group as the Taliban, but fighting and training and learning alongside other fellow Afghans for the sake of his country, and really believing in his cause, really believing that the training that he was going to get was for a reason, for the sake of his country, for the sake of the future generations. He spoke to me about his mother. I spoke to his mother on the phone. They didn't want to film it, but she said to me, I'm so proud of him, and I don't want to see him come back in a body bag, but I'm proud of why he wanted to join, and I'm proud of the training that he's gotten, and I'm proud of the uniform that he has. I interviewed a translator as well, and in sort of the days following and he worked with the US military. He was on a base. He was quite well known, and he was working between the Afghan forces and the Americans. And there was something that he said to me, which really has stuck with me. He said to me, I'm burning my uniform right now. I'm burning all my documents right now. As we speak, the Taliban have taken over this city, and I'm burning everything. And there were so many households and people that I was speaking to from the military, and translators, and people at the American University of Afghanistan, and anyone who had an association with America, who were suddenly wiping out their social media, who were burning their uniforms, who were burning their documents. Students that I support through my foundation at the American University of Afghanistan were burying their documents in their gardens. They were what they couldn't burn, they were burying. And there was something about that that really stuck with me, about the real fear, everything that we went into to deliver for that country, and the promise. I mean, so many of these people have said to me, we stuck our necks out on a whim based on a promise of America that, we will finance you, we will inspire you, we will shelter you, we will fund you. Come with us. It's a project that we're doing together, Project Afghanistan. And in the end, they betrayed us. They abandoned us. And there was that feeling right across the board. Every single phone call I've been taking in the last few weeks is, why? Why did this need to happen? It didn't need to get this way. It didn't need to be this way. Sure, you want to leave. We've known for a long time you want to leave. But did you need to leave in this way, where we feel completely humiliated?
It's really perverse. It's a perverse, I think, reversal of morality. And I think it was extraordinary several months ago when that letter was leaked from Secretary Blinken to President Ghani, saying, you need to do more for peace. Right? I wonder why he didn't write a similar letter to Hibatullah Akhundzada. And while Ambassador Khalilzad was conspiring, I guess, with Hamid Karzai and Abdullah against the sitting president of Afghanistan, while that was happening, we were weakening the Afghan government, weakening its legitimacy, and we were actually partnering with the Taliban and advocating for a Taliban say in the future government of Afghanistan, in what they hoped would be this sort of inclusive coalition government. And so I think that what this did is it set up the Afghan people, Afghan armed forces, and the government for a rapid collapse. And I wanted to ask you, what do you attribute the rapid collapse to? I remember in the documentary, the scene where you're driving through Kabul on the way to see the vice president. You talk about being stuck in traffic and the eerie feeling that you have that something's changing in the city. And did you have any idea while you were shooting that the Taliban takeover could have happened so quickly? And what would you attribute the collapse to?
Yeah, not at all. People ask me, and I think that it's going to that military base, speaking to all the people who, like I said, the Masouds or the Shahrazads in that film, who have the foreign visas to get out, but choosing to stay within the communities, even though they are looking down the barrel of a gun every day. They face the threat of targeted killings, and they face the threat of an explosion. They face the threat of death every day. They chose to stay. They chose to fight because they believed that the state would remain, that the institutions would not collapse, that weirdly, that the security blanket that the United States had provided them, even with 2,500 or 3,500 troops, was sufficient. There was a security blanket with that. They didn't view the United States as occupiers. They didn't view the United States as a nuisance or a presence that they didn't want. They saw it as a security blanket for themselves. And they've told me this, just the small, they're not present, we don't see them. The Afghan National Army are the ones fighting the war. We don't see the presence of the Americans in the same way as we did in the early days. They're sort of behind the scenes now, and in the provinces and in the villages, there's sort of air support, but no longer in Kabul, no longer in the major cities. We're living our own life, and we've taken this country into our own hands. And so I suppose there was this sense of, again, the kind of betrayal of where they are now. Even General McMaster, their presence in the airport in the last days gave some kind of hope to people that they felt safe. And as soon as that last C-17 left and the last soldier left, there really was finally, that's when I got the sense from many of my Afghan friends and contacts, it just suddenly dawned on them that the lights have been turned out and there's a darkness now in Kabul and across Afghanistan, and we are alone. I mean, to think that even when, NATO allies and the US couldn't step foot out of the airport, and they were sort of held within the gates of the military side of the airport, Afghans still felt protected. And so when that flight took off, there was this sense that this dark curtain has been drawn, and now we will be forgotten.
Yalda, you mentioned, I think, an important factor in our self-defeat, I would say, our surrender and self-defeat in Afghanistan was just a misframing of the war, right? This narrative of the graveyard of empires, as if America was there for imperial purposes, and a failure to recognize that we were fighting, enabling really Afghan forces to bear the brunt of the fight against really the enemies of all humanity, and especially now the Afghan people. What do you think led to that fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict? Is there more that your profession might have done, or any of us might have done, to help citizens in the democracies that were sustaining this effort in Afghanistan to understand better the nature of the conflict, what was at stake there, and what the costs of this kind of a precipitous withdrawal, what costs we and the Afghan people would incur?
I think, as you know, it was mission accomplished 3 months after the war began in Afghanistan in October 2001. And there really was, as you say, this felt like a 1-year war that was fought 20 times over, rather than kind of a policy or an understanding of really investing in Afghanistan. It always, in the reporting or the understanding of Afghanistan, it was really kind of the less sexier of the two wars between Iraq and Afghanistan, or the one that was sort of forgotten. And what's been really interesting was that this administration took a forgotten war and put it in sort of American households on the front of newspapers and into their sort of television screens, the horror that we saw unfold in those final days at the airport. And when that sort of, American Air Force plane, military plane took off from that runway and people were literally plunging to their deaths, I think it almost summed up the sort of the tragedy of Afghanistan, where ultimately, a plane full of American military personnel and diplomats were leaving, and the Afghans were plunging to their deaths and being left behind somewhere that they no longer felt was theirs, that they built something over 2 decades. And now this was a land, a country, a place that they no longer recognized. And this whole notion that this is a graveyard of empires. Like I said, the Afghan people, in my conversations with them, didn't view Americans as occupiers. The only people who are now selling this as a graveyard of empires are the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's General Command issued a statement yesterday congratulating the Taliban for their historic victory and their historic win. And we saw, some video emerge that showed the head of security of Al-Qaeda, Amin al-Haq, apparently in Nangarhar, in eastern Afghanistan. So
pulling up in his white SUV to a welcoming crowd. Yeah, right.
Absolutely, to a hero's welcome. And so really it's been the jihadi community now who have seen this as a graveyard of empires. It's being sold that way. It's being hailed that way. It's being sort of, celebrated in that way, that this is what we've done. And Zabiullah Mujahid said that in his statements after the withdrawal, after the 31st. He said, if you come here with bad intentions, we're going to send you away. And it doesn't matter which superpower you are. This is what happens when people come here. We are the graveyard of empires. It's fed into that narrative more so than anything else. What has happened has fed into the jihadi narrative.
And it's just a trope. It's ahistorical. And, I think that we've seen kind of the opposite of reality in Washington, right? So, for example, we heard that we didn't want to extend the August 31st deadline because it would have increased risk to U.S. soldiers and the U.S. military. But instead, we're leaving U.S. civilians and other civilians behind, as if maybe, I guess, the U.S. military will only be committed to places that are safe in the future. I mean, I just don't understand really the logic behind leaving people behind. And you were part of an effort to really help people escape, right? And so I'd like to ask you, maybe would you share some of your actions to do that? What you gleaned from the chaotic environment associated with the incomplete evacuation, and then what happens next in terms of this humanitarian catastrophe that we've seen unfold, really mainly in Kabul, but I'm sure this is happening in Herat, in Mazar, in Jalalabad, in Kandahar as well.
Yeah, I think what's been extraordinary is, some people have described it as the Saigon moment. Some people have described it as the Dunkirk moment. I think what it showed actually is that for the Afghan people, certainly, that for all the disappointment that they felt towards America's political class, there were some extraordinary Americans who came out and assisted in the effort of evacuation. Private individuals who felt quite deeply hurt. And at least it has been quite a painful moment for so many people who have been invested in Afghanistan, like yourself, who believed in Afghanistan, who believed in the cause. So, a group of us, like so many other individuals, came together to assist people who were part of the brightest and the best, but we knew weren't on any real lists of people to evacuate. And we got a bunch of journalists out. We got a bunch of students from the American University of Afghanistan out. Got some civil society people out, and some artists. We helped evacuate, but we were really part of this small window because it registered for me on the kind of Thursday before the fall of Kabul. So it might have been about the 12th of August or the 11th of August, where after Mazar fell, and then when Helmand fell, I thought, if Helmand falls, then Kandahar falls, and that's the road to Kabul. That's when it's game over. And that's when we started to mobilize. And I said to myself, we've got at best till this weekend, and sort of at worst, Kabul could fall even sooner. So all the intelligence reports that were coming out, earlier in that week saying there's 90 days till the fall of Kabul. In fact, I thought that was premature because I suppose I was not being naive. I'd just come back from Afghanistan. I'd spoken to these soldiers. I'd spoken to people like the Vice President who were remaining defiant. We're not going to surrender. We've got this 180,000 strong force, and we're going to go out there and we're going to take on the Taliban. We're going to fight and take back our country. And then, of course, you remember the demonstrations that we saw across all of the various cities in Afghanistan where people were in support of the Afghan National Army coming out and chanting and expressing that they didn't want the Taliban to take over the country. So we swung into action. I think we got a little bit lucky because we're almost ahead of the pack. We swung into action on the Thursday and the Friday, and we're trying to move people out by the Sunday. In fact, we were ready to get out on the Sunday. And then, of course, Kabul fell. And then there were no flights. And so we managed to mobilize some people and get them out to Albania. And we've got a group of students, journalists, civil society in Albania at the moment. And we interviewed the Albanian Prime Minister, and he said, we're a poor nation, but we were Afghans once too. And we looked out to the international community for help. And at the time, we felt the world looked away from us. How can we look away now? And perhaps, richer nations don't have memory. We have memory, and we understand history. And so that's why we are going to be generous and take in as many Afghans as we possibly can. And so I think that is one snapshot of what's going on, where private individuals have managed to take out certain groups and certain people. Having said that, 38 million people remain in the country. Pakistan has closed its borders for the time being and not letting any more Afghans. They talk about the 3 million Afghans that they've had for decades, and they don't want any more Afghans entering their country. Iran is now closing off their borders. In many ways, so many Afghans say to me, we feel like we're in a prison. We've been trapped, and we're waiting for these international flights to open up. But there does feel like something more profound and greater is happening here with this mass exodus of Afghans at this sort of turning point. I mean, as you know, Afghanistan has had a tumultuous, rocky sort of 4 decades. But this feels like the most uncertain time. This feels like sort of a time like no other, not like when the Soviets left, not like during the Civil War, not like when the Taliban took over, and certainly not like when the Taliban fell in 9/11. This, for so many people, now feels like, tens of thousands of people want to get out, and they probably won't look back.
Yalda, this I think what I'd like to hear is your thoughts on what does happen next, right? I think we're recognizing now that lost wars have consequences, and of course, we're seeing some of the security consequences you mentioned. That a victory for the Taliban in Afghanistan is a victory for Al Qaeda and other jihadist terrorists. I couldn't believe the images, right, of these terrorists who had the most advanced kit, who were outfitted by Pakistan's ISI with the Gulf donations that flow in to the ISI to build this. I'm talking about this Brigade 313 that is an Al Qaeda brigade, essentially within the Taliban, that took over the airport. Of course, giving the lie to this idea that these are separate organizations. So we know that we have a greater threat from jihadist terrorism. We're just seeing the beginning, I think, of obviously a humanitarian catastrophe, just the beginning of it. And of course, there'll be political ramifications associated with the belief that we just don't have the will, right, to defend ourselves or to see through missions that have significant consequences for us and others around the world. What do you see happening next, right? I think that some Americans think, wow, that was really bad. That horrible evacuation during which I think our military did an amazing job with a terrible mission, right, under tremendous constraints. I mean, the forces that were there, but it was a catastrophe in terms of that evacuation itself. But that's just the beginning. So, what do you think happens next? What are you most concerned about the future?
Yeah, I'm most concerned, I think, about Afghanistan being forgotten like it was in the 90s. And someone said something very clever to me the other day. They said that in 1996, you had to be pretty imaginative to think that Afghanistan would become a terrorist haven and then 9/11 would happen. In 2021, you have to have amnesia, to think that that's not how it would play out again. And really, I think that there's an attempt by governments to rush to legitimize the Taliban now. And there's an attempt to work with them in sort of counterterrorism. We saw the horrific drone strike that took place in the center of Kabul just 2 days ago, where 10 Afghan civilians were killed. The head of the household worked in the Afghan army. He was an interpreter for the US military, and they had an SIV to come and travel to the United States. And that the house the drone fell on, and 7 of their children were killed, the youngest age 2. So my concern is, who gave the coordinates? There's a lot of questions that need to be asked about, who was working with who to give the US the coordinates for that strike. How much can the Taliban be a reliable partner in terms of counterterrorism? They sort of talk about maintaining security at the moment, and there not being any blasts. And so many Kabul residents say to me, yes, because they were doing it. And that's why there is security now in terms of bomb blasts and attacks. And we're not seeing that on that same scale. It's because, well, the Taliban were behind it. And so the focus now being on ISIS-K. I mean, my greatest concern is that this war is now taking a whole other shape and phase, and that's the concern of so many Afghans I speak to. Where is this now going? Are we just going to be a land forgotten where drone strikes happen night and day because of an attempt to strike out ISIS, and the Taliban become the partners in counterterrorism, and sort of the accountability or holding them accountable doesn't take place because of the desperation to keep our streets in New York or London safe, and so that we do see a collapse of a state again, where the economy, completely falls apart, and people, we have sort of a famine and a drought already that's taking place. We see more of a mass exodus, and we see people turning up on the sort of shores of Europe and the United States seeking asylum. And really, I mean, I was speaking to someone from the UN the other day, and I asked him, do you think this was imposed? The humanitarian crisis has been imposed because it was avoidable, with sort of a handful of troops or a different strategy. We're now seeing a sort of a catastrophe unfolding where we could see the collapse of the state. We could see Afghanistan becoming a haven for terrorism again. We could see a huge humanitarian crisis, all of which could have been avoided.
And maybe it's past time to stop pretending, right? Maybe we should stop pretending that the Taliban is going to be a partner with us. Maybe we should stop pretending that there's a bold line between the Taliban and jihadist terrorist organizations. Maybe we should stop pretending that this was just some sort of rural militia movement rather than one that was supported by the Pakistanis and the ISI and the Russians and the Iranians, and recognize that the future of Afghanistan can't be in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. And what I'm worried about, Yalda, is what you just said, is that there's going to be this rush to legitimize the Taliban, to turn a blind eye to their true nature, and to restart aid in a way that seems to be neutral. But there's a false nobility associated with that neutrality, because, of course, the Taliban will do everything they can to capture and weaponize that aid, for example. So I'd like to maybe just conclude with, is there an alternative future? You interviewed Amrullah Saleh, someone who I have tremendous respect for. A lot of Americans didn't like him because he was so brash, but I loved him for it, right? He never sugarcoated anything. He's been utterly consistent since 2001 in terms of his commitment to prevent the Taliban from taking over. He's now leading a resistance movement in the Panjshir Valley. When I hear we need to talk with the Taliban about the future of Afghanistan, aren't there other Afghans who we should talk to about the future of Afghanistan? What do you think the alternatives are, and how should we be thinking about the future of the country?
I think what's happened, sadly and unfortunately, is that we are now left with the Taliban. They are in power. And when we talk about even an inclusive government, it doesn't seem like any of these other Afghan players are going to be part of that. So much has been promised by the Taliban to their own different factions and elements that I think it's going to be a very difficult task now for the international community to support and recognize the movement in Panjshir, for example, or to try and prop up or support any of the other elements in the country. And I think the other thing that the international community needs to be mindful of is, who are the remaining embassies in the country? Who are the nations and states who have said or expressed interest in having friendlier relationships with the Taliban? The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Pakistanis. they're the ones that haven't left the country. It's almost like Afghanistan has become a gift, to these countries. I mean, the Chinese, for example, gave virtually a state visit to the Taliban a month before their takeover, and expressed that they were happy to work with them. And in return, the Taliban said the issue of the Uyghurs is their internal matter. It's not an issue that is of concern for the treatment of Uyghurs. It's an internal Chinese matter. And so I suppose the agreement, if you read between the lines, is, as long as you don't make too much noise about the 1 million Uyghurs in a detention facility and say that we need to do something about those Muslims, we will happily turn a blind eye to whatever's going on in your country and supply you with the aid and the assistance that you also need. So the question now becomes, even though the Taliban are desperate to be legitimized by the international community, have they become so savvy that previous foes have now become friends, namely the Iranians, the Russians, even India? A month before the fall of Kabul, the Indians expressed that perhaps we could work with the Taliban. If there is security and stability in the country, perhaps we could work together. This is now a Taliban that are far savvier, far sharper, far more aware of what the messaging needs to be and what they need to do in order to get legitimacy, counterterrorism being one of them. So portraying ISIS-K, a small, offshoot of the Islamic State, as a big problem for the West. And look, they went straight into the airport and they blew, themselves up. And in 2 years, we didn't see any U.S. service men killed, and now we have 13 killed. And this is ISIS, and it wasn't us. So counterterrorism being one factor, and also this concern that perhaps, if China is turning Afghanistan into an arena of great power competition, then it forces the Western world to engage with them as well, rather than discard them or turn them into a pariah state.
Right. It's really astonishing the degree to which your documentary and those who you've interviewed, really draw into question the fundamental misunderstanding of the war. And what has become really the conventional wisdom about the war, right? That we didn't achieve anything, that the Taliban would be a more benign organization, that there's a bold line between them and other jihadist terrorist organizations, that there would be no profound consequences essentially from disengaging from Afghanistan. I just want to thank you for your reporting over the years, and for your humanitarian actions at your foundation, what you've done to help get people out in recent weeks, and for joining us. And on behalf of the Hoover Institution, Yalda, I want to thank you for helping us learn more about what is still a battleground, important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, General.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.